All right, so I'm going to walk through how to do numbers 8 and 9 on that chapter 10 review. First one, number 8, gives us that the volume of a square pyramid is given by the formula V equals 1/3 hx squared, where h is the height, x is the length of one side of the base. Pyramid with a height of 15 feet has a volume of 2,880 feet. What is the length? Okay. And even if we can't visualize a square pyramid, even if that's a little bit confusing to us, one thing we can do is we can recognize that they're giving us a formula. And really, what this all comes back down to is identifying key info to set something up and then working from there. So I'm just going to write down the variables they give me, that h is the height and x is the length of one side of the base. Okay. Also going to jot down the formula they give me. And when looking at this, what I see is I'm just going to plug in the info that I know and then solve for what they're asking me. So I know the volume is 2,880 feet cubed. I know the height is 15 feet. What I don't know, use a different color, is the length of one side of the base. That's the question they're asking me. They want to know the length of one side of the base. And the good news is that just by taking the key info and plugging it in based on what they told me, I quickly get to a place where I've only got one variable, this variable x, which is the length of one side of the base that I'm going to solve for. And so to solve for it, I'm going to solve for x. So the first thing I can do is I can do this 1/3 times 15, and that gives me 5x squared. To isolate x, I'm going to go ahead and divide by 5. And when I do that, I get x squared equals 576. And so if I take the square root of that, okay, because I have something squared equals 576, so the something, okay, if something squared, if something multiplied by itself gives me 576, then x is going to be whatever multiplies by itself to give you 576. How do you find the things that multiply by themselves to give you 576? Take the square root. But remember, we always need to consider the positive and the negative square root when we're finding square roots, unless we're told otherwise. And when we do that, we get x is equal to plus or minus 24. Now, what's important, the last step in the word problems, is not just to circle it and move on, as if we were just solving some general quadratic equation or finding the x-intercepts of some general quadratic equation, but with the word problem, we need to interpret it. And what did x stand for? Well, x was the length of one side of the base. So if I get plus or minus 24, I need to recognize that, well, this setup here models, okay, this quadratic equation here, or quadratic function here, that we turn into a quadratic equation, models kind of what's happening here. It only models it for positive values because we're talking about lengths and heights. You can't have negative lengths and heights. So our conclusion here is really that x equals 24 feet. And again, that goes back to they're asking for the length of one side of a base. We solve the quadratic kind that models the situation, but we understand to effectively model the situation, we can only consider positive values. So x is going to equal 24 feet. Let's move on to number 9. Area of a rectangular soccer field is 5,000 yards squared. I think this one's maybe a little bit easier to visualize. Draw a rectangle. Put the 5,000 in the middle because that's our area. The length of the field is twice the width. Find the dimensions. Well, what are the dimensions? All the dimensions are is they want the length and they want the width. Okay, so I want the length and the width of my soccer field. Okay, we don't know what the length and the width are. That's why they're asking us for them. But we do know that the length is twice the width. Okay, so if the length equals twice the width, or in other words, if you double the width, you get the length, that clearly tells us that the length is the bigger of the two. And we can actually turn this into a little equation. We can say that the length is equal to twice the width. And that just comes from really writing in mathy terms what the sentence is saying. The length of the field is, aka L equals twice the width. If I double the width, that is equivalent to the length. Okay, another way of saying it would be that half the length equals the width, okay, depending on how you want to think about it. So we need to find the dimensions. What we do know is we know the area, and so we can apply what we know about area of a rectangle. We know area of a rectangle can be defined as length of the rectangle times the width. Plugging in what we know, we get 5,000 equals LW. And if we didn't have that second sentence, we'd be stuck at this point because we'd have an equation that has two variables and there's no effective way to isolate one of the variables in a way where we get W equals a number, L equals a number. But what we can do is we can use our knowledge that the length is twice the width to rewrite this as an equation with one variable, right? If the length is twice the width, then instead of an L here, I can put a 2W in. And why that's helpful is now I only have one variable. And so I can then multiply those two together and get 2W squared. And I can solve for W again, because there's no B term here. It's not like we have something times W. I can just isolate the W by taking the square root. So I get 2,500 equals W squared. What that means is the square roots of 2,500 are going to equal W, or another way of saying that, you could take the square root of both sides. Square root both sides. Remember, we got to consider the positive and the negative case. And we get plus or minus 50 equals W. Again, we need to remember the context of the problem. We're dealing with length and width. Doesn't really make sense to have a negative width. So even though the general quadratic has two solutions, for it to model our problem, it only models it effectively for positive values. So we're only going to consider the positive solution here. And the tempting thing here is to go, sweet, I'm done. The width is 50. But remember, they asked you for the dimensions, right? So we know that the width is 50. Okay, 50 yards specifically using our units. But we still need to find the length. Well, again, go back to that second sentence, and it's why I like having a second equation written for that, is I can use this now that I know my width. If the width is 50, then the length has to equal double that. So what does the length equal? 100. So your conclusion is that your length is 100 and your width is 50. These are the dimensions of the soccer field that have an area of 5,000 and meet the criteria that the length is twice the width. Hope this helps. Good luck with your studying.